The October fog of 1894 had settled upon London with the persistence of an unwelcome guest, transforming the familiar thoroughfares into a maze of grey shadows and muffled sounds. From the windows of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, the world appeared as though viewed through muslin, with only the occasional yellow glow of a gas lamp piercing the gloom. I had risen early that morning to find Holmes already stationed in his armchair beside the dying embers of our fire, his long, angular frame draped in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the swirling mist beyond our window. "Remarkable, Watson," said he, without favouring me with so much as a glance, "that the fellow from the corner tobacconist should prove himself so philanthropic in his business dealings." I paused in the act of stirring the coals, somewhat puzzled by this observation. "Philanthropic? I fear I must have missed some act of charity, Holmes. He charged me the usual price for my tobacco yesterday, and a dear price it was. Yet he pressed upon you a box of lucifers, which you neither requested nor required." Holmes gestured with one languid finger toward the mantelpiece, where indeed a gaudy foreign matchbox lay beside my tobacco pouch. "Observe the Continental label, Watson. He has found himself overstocked with an inferior brand. Note the sulphurous odour that clings to the box even now, and rather than suffer a total loss, he distributes them as complimentary gifts to his regular customers. Philanthropy, my dear fellow, is often nothing more than enlightened self-interest wearing the mask of generosity." Before I could formulate a response to this characteristic display of deductive reasoning, the sharp clatter of a hansom cab upon the cobblestones below drew our attention. The vehicle had scarcely come to a halt when we heard the rapid tread of feet upon our stairs, followed by Mrs. Hudson's familiar voice raised in protest against such an early intrusion. Her objections were swept aside, however, as Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard burst into our sitting room, his weathered face flushed with cold and bearing an expression of barely contained urgency. "Mr. Holmes! Dr. Watson!" he exclaimed, still clutching his bowler hat in one gloved hand while attempting to catch his breath. "Forgive the early hour, gentlemen, but we have a case that defies all conventional explanation. I fear Scotland Yard stands utterly baffled." Holmes had risen at Lestrade's entrance, the languid air falling from him like a discarded garment. His entire aspect transformed in an instant, the keen intelligence that lay always just beneath the surface now blazing forth with unmistakable intensity. He indicated the chair opposite his own with a graceful gesture. "Pray be seated, Inspector, and tell us what has brought you through the fog at such an unseasonable hour. Your manner suggests a matter of considerable urgency." Lestrade settled himself into the proffered chair, though his agitation remained evident in the way his fingers drummed against the crown of his hat. "Indeed it is, Mr. Holmes. We have a young woman dead in most peculiar circumstances, murdered by all appearances. Yet the evidence she has left behind is so extraordinary as to challenge the very foundations of criminal investigation. You intrigue me, Lestrade. Pray continue." The inspector reached into his coat and withdrew a flat leather portfolio, which he placed upon our centre table with the reverent care one might reserve for a religious relic. "The victim is Miss Lydia Rowan, aged 22, an artist of considerable talent and a student at the Slade School. She maintained a small studio in Montague Place, near the British Museum, where she both lived and worked. Yesterday evening, her landlady, Mrs. Battersby, heard her moving about in her rooms as usual. This morning, when Miss Rowan failed to appear for breakfast, the door was forced. She was found lying beside her easel, strangled by person or persons unknown." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The circumstances of the room?" "Locked from within, Mr. Holmes, with the key in the deceased's pocket. No sign of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. The window overlooks a narrow courtyard with no access from below and was found securely fastened. By all appearances, she admitted her killer willingly, or the killer was already known to her." Holmes finished, "But you mentioned evidence of an extraordinary nature." In response, Lestrade opened the portfolio and carefully withdrew a sheet of heavy drawing paper mounted upon a wooden board. As he turned it toward the light, I felt my breath catch involuntarily. Upon the paper, executed in charcoal with remarkable skill and precision, was the portrait of a man's face. A face rendered with such lifelike accuracy that it seemed almost to possess a malevolent intelligence of its own. The subject appeared to be a gentleman of middle years, with heavy, brutal features that spoke of a coarse nature despite the obvious quality of his dress. His hair was closely cropped in the military fashion, and a distinctive crescent-shaped scar marked his left temple. Most striking of all was a signet ring upon his hand, clearly depicted in the foreground of the composition, bearing the device of a griffin rampant. The eyes, though rendered in mere charcoal and white chalk, seemed to burn with a cold, predatory light that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Extraordinary work," murmured Holmes, taking up his magnifying lens to examine the drawing more closely. The hand that created this possessed both training and considerable natural ability. But surely, Lestrade, you have not called upon us merely to admire the artistic accomplishments of the deceased. The charcoal was still warm when we found her, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. According to Dr. Morrison's examination, Miss Rowan died sometime between 9:30 and 10 o'clock last evening. The drawing was completed within moments of her death, perhaps even as her killer approached. She drew her own murderer, sir, captured his likeness with her dying breath, and yet, Holmes prompted, and yet not a soul in London will admit to recognizing the face. We have shown the portrait to her landlady, her fellow students, her few known associates. All claim never to have seen the man before. It is as though she has drawn a phantom, Mr. Holmes, a face that exists only in charcoal and shadow. Holmes set down his lens and moved to the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street below. For several moments he remained silent, his sharp profile etched against the grey light like a figure from a cameo. When at length he spoke, his voice carried a note of barely suppressed excitement. "Tell me, Inspector, was anything else discovered in Miss Rowan's studio? Any indication of what might have brought her killer to her door?" "The room was neat as a pin, sir, save for the usual artist's clutter. We found fresh wrapping paper in the wastebasket, French from a house called Giraud and Fils, suggesting she had recently acquired new materials. There was also—" Lestrade consulted his notebook. "A curious smear upon the mantelpiece, amber in color. The doctor believes it to be some form of resin or varnish, though its significance escapes us." Holmes turned from the window, his eyes now bright with that peculiar intensity I'd learned to associate with the scent of a promising case. "Watson, your coat and hat. Inspector, I trust the scene remains undisturbed." "As much as circumstances permit, Mr. Holmes. I have stationed a constable at the door with strict instructions that nothing is to be touched." "Excellent. Then we shall examine Miss Rowan's final masterpiece in its proper setting." Holmes was already reaching for his ulster, his movements quick and purposeful. "For I suspect, gentlemen, that this portrait holds secrets far more profound than the mere identity of a killer. When an artist draws with death at her shoulder, every line becomes a clue, every shadow a whisper of truth. Miss Lydia Rowan may be beyond our help, but her final work shall speak for her, if we possess the wit to understand its language." As we prepared to venture forth into the fog-bound streets, I found myself studying the charcoal portrait once more. The face that stared back at me from the paper seemed to mock our efforts with its silent, knowing gaze. Yet I had learned to trust in Holmes's extraordinary abilities, and if anyone could unravel the mystery of the girl who drew her killer, it would be my remarkable friend. The game, as he would say, was afoot. The journey through the fog-shrouded streets of Bloomsbury proved as treacherous as it was atmospheric, our hansom cab crawling through the October mist with the cautious deliberation of a vessel navigating uncharted waters. The familiar landmarks of London had been transformed into ghostly suggestions of their former selves, with gas lamps flickering like dying stars in the impenetrable gloom. Holmes sat in contemplative silence for much of the journey, his aquiline features set in that expression of intense concentration I had come to recognize as the outward manifestation of his extraordinary mental processes. As we passed Russell Square, our driver drew aside to allow passage to a coster's barrow. A telegraph boy, his cap askew and legs streaked with mud, darted before our horse and nearly came to grief. He snatched at a long blue envelope that had slipped from his satchel, jamming it back with a guilty start that did not escape my companion's notice. "Observe the vamp of his boots, Watson," murmured Holmes without raising his eyes from their apparent contemplation of the fog. "The polish is brushed only upon the outer edges. A left-handed lad, careless at his work, and in evident haste to make up time for an errand he dare not confess to having delayed. Note how he has already broken the seal of that envelope and regummed it clumsily. There is still adhesive upon his thumb, and the envelope sits unevenly in his satchel. A small transgression, perhaps, but one which will cost him sixpence if his sergeant possesses any powers of observation whatever." Lestrade, who had been fidgeting with his notebook throughout the journey, looked up with that mixture of irritation and reluctant admiration that Holmes's casual demonstrations invariably provoked. "All very clever, Mr. Holmes, but surely we have more pressing matters than the peccadilloes of telegraph boys." "Indeed we do, Inspector," Holmes replied with a slight smile. "Yet it serves to illustrate a fundamental principle of investigation, that the impossible is generally nothing more than the improbable viewed through the lens of insufficient observation. Our young messenger there appears to have committed an impossibility, opening a sealed envelope without detection. Yet the evidence of his transgression is written plainly upon his person, for any who possess the wit to read it. The parallel to our current case was not lost upon me, and I found myself wondering what subtle evidence Miss Lydia Rowan's killer might have inadvertently left behind, confident in the impossibility of his crime's solution. We turned at last into Montague Place, where the lofty Georgian terraces loomed like cliffs through the mist. The narrow street, lined with respectable but modest town-houses, bore that particular air of genteel shabbiness that characterizes the quarters favored by artists, students, and others of limited but refined circumstances. A uniformed constable stood sentinel beside the door of one such establishment, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air as he acknowledged Inspector Lestrade's approach. "Any disturbances, Constable?" "Morrison?" Lestrade inquired as we alighted from our cab. "None, sir. Mrs. Battersby is in her parlour, and I've kept Miss Rowan's room sealed as ordered. The doctor finished his examination an hour past." Holmes was already studying the building's exterior with that peculiar intensity he brought to all matters of investigation. His keen gaze travelled from the ground-floor windows to the upper stories, pausing at the narrow alleyway that separated the townhouse from its neighbour. "The rear access, Inspector?" "A small courtyard, but Miss Rowan's window overlooks it from the second floor. The drop would be considerable, and there are no convenient means of ascent." Before Holmes could respond, the front door opened to reveal a woman of perhaps 50 years, possessed of that comfortable roundness that speaks of a life devoted to domestic concerns. Her eyes were red-rimmed with recent weeping, and her hands trembled slightly as she pressed a damp handkerchief to her lips. "Oh, Inspector Lestrade," she said in a voice thick with emotion. "Such a terrible business. Poor Miss Rowan was like a daughter to me. Who could have done such a dreadful thing to such a sweet, quiet girl?" Holmes stepped forward with that courtly manner he reserved for distressed ladies. "Mrs. Battersby, I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are here to assist Inspector Lestrade in his investigation. Might I ask you a few questions about your tenant?" The landlady nodded eagerly, clearly grateful for any opportunity to contribute to the pursuit of justice. "Anything that might help catch the monster who did this, sir. You mentioned that Miss Rowan had seemed preoccupied recently. Can you be more specific about when this began?" Mrs. Battersby considered the question carefully. "It would have been last Tuesday, sir, when she returned from her morning classes at the Slade. She seemed excited, I suppose, but also nervous, quite unlike her usual composed manner. She spent the remainder of the day in her studio, working with unusual intensity. I heard her moving about well into the night, which was most unlike her customary habits." "Did she receive any visitors during this period? Any correspondence or packages?" "No visitors that I observed, sir, but there was a package delivery on Wednesday morning, from France, by the appearance of the wrapping. She seemed quite pleased to receive it and carried it to her studio immediately. There was also—" Mrs. Battersby hesitated, wringing her handkerchief. "There was a gentleman caller some weeks past, foreign by his manner of dress. His coat was cut in the continental fashion, shorter than our English style, and he wore a smooth hat with a low crown. He spoke with a curious accent and carried about him a sweetish scent that reminded me of the penny fare." Holmes's nostrils had dilated at these words, and I observed that familiar spark of interest kindle in his grey eyes. "Most illuminating, Mrs. Battersby. Now, if you would be so kind as to allow us to examine Miss Rowan's studio." The narrow staircase creaked beneath our feet as we ascended to the second floor, past a landing where a cracked plaster bust of Minerva presided in dusty severity. At the top, Constable Morrison produced a key and unlocked the door to reveal the scene of the tragedy. The studio was a long garret, illuminated by a large north-facing window glazed with small panes through which the grey October light filtered with pale reluctance. The room bore all the characteristic disorder of an artist's workspace. Canvases in various stages of completion lined the walls. Brushes and charcoal sticks lay scattered across a paint-stained table, and the mingled odors of turpentine and linseed oil hung heavy in the air, now tainted with the more sinister undertones that death inevitably brings to any enclosed space. Miss Rowan lay upon a threadbare rug beside her easel, her hands lightly clenched, her dark hair disordered across one pale cheek. The livid marks upon her throat spoke eloquently of the manner of her death, yet her face, though bearing the peculiar intentness that sometimes follows sudden death, showed no signs of the terror one might expect from a victim of violent crime. Holmes's first action was to examine the window, testing the sash and scrutinizing the putty and paint along the edges with his magnifying lens. Finding it securely fastened, he turned his attention to the door, crouching to examine the brass escutcheon and the keyhole itself. "The key, Inspector?" Lestrade produced it wrapped in a handkerchief. Holmes took it by its ribbon and peered at both the bit and the keyhole, then ran his long forefinger lightly along the inner edge of the door. A tiny glitter clung to his skin when he held it to the light. "Metal filings," he murmured, "so fine as to be nearly invisible to the naked eye. We shall discuss their significance presently." He moved to the mantelpiece, where he lifted between thumb and forefinger a translucent amber smear. Bringing it close to the dying coals in the grate, he warmed it slightly and inhaled. Not varnish, as initially supposed, but rosine, the variety used by violinists, though artists may employ it as well for certain techniques. "Like the fiddlers use?" Lestrade asked. "Precisely. Yet Miss Rowan possesses no other trace of the substance among her materials." Holmes's keen eyes swept the room methodically. "Watson, would you be so good as to examine the victim's hands?" I knelt beside the poor girl and studied her fingers carefully. Beneath the nails was the fine grey residue that charcoal inevitably leaves, but no trace of skin or hair that would indicate a struggle. On her left wrist, however, I discovered a faint indentation, not a bruise, but a delicate line barely visible upon the pale skin. "A ligature mark," I reported. "Made by something soft, silk most likely, and applied only moments before death." Holmes nodded grimly. "So our killer employed both silk cord and manual strangulation. The neighbors heard nothing because the victim was already restrained when the fatal pressure was applied." He turned his attention to the easel, where the portrait stared at us with its cold, implacable gaze, the crescent scar upon the temple, the cropped hair, the heavy jaw, and that griffin rampant engraved so boldly upon the signet ring. Raising his lens, Holmes bent so close to the drawing that his nose nearly touched the paper. For several minutes he remained thus, his eyes passing not only over the features, but examining the subtle matters of shading, the direction of the cross-hatching, and the rich, velvety blacks laid alongside the clean, unblended lines. "Watson," he said at length, "what do you make of the lighting in this portrait?" The light falls from the left, as evidenced by the shadows cast along the cheek and jaw. Just so. Yet observe that the north window lies to the sitter's right. Most curious. He stepped aside and adjusted the easel's position by perhaps 6 inches, then replaced it with surveyor-like precision. Mrs. Battersby mentioned that Miss Rowan had recently moved a second chair to catch the light by the window. The landlady nodded. "Only last week, sir." Holmes indicated a clean ellipse upon the dusty floorboards where furniture had recently stood, though elsewhere the accumulated dust lay undisturbed. The second chair now sat before the easel, its front legs pressed slightly deeper into the floor than its rear ones, as though someone of considerable weight had leaned forward in it. Stooping, Holmes plucked delicately at the cane seat and held up for our inspection a short, coarse hair, light in color and distinctly stiff. "Not from the lady, nor from Mrs. Battersby, who is dark-haired. This belongs to a fair or sandy-haired man, and observe how the scales catch the light. It is from a beard. Our gentleman is not so young as some might suppose." He crossed to a small table where torn French wrapping paper lay in 2 pieces. "Giraud and Fils, Paris, Rue des Beaux-Arts," he read aloud. "Miss Rowan received a parcel, yet the fixative bottle upon her shelf is nearly empty and of English manufacture. She did not change her usual materials, then. The question becomes, what did she acquire from this Parisian establishment?" "What indeed?" I asked, finding myself drawn deeper into the puzzle. Holmes glanced at me with that quick spark of intellectual excitement I knew so well. "Her mind, perhaps, Watson, or possibly her subject." From somewhere in the building below came the distant, uncertain sawing of a violin. Someone practicing scales with more enthusiasm than skill. Holmes lifted his head at the sound, and for a moment an odd expression, half amusement and half something approaching pity, passed across his sharp features. "The house has its own peculiar harmonies," he observed. "Come, gentlemen, Miss Rowan has provided us with one service in her final portrait. I'm curious to discover whether she has rendered us a second. The game, as they say, is most decidedly afoot." As we prepared to leave the studio, I found myself studying the charcoal portrait once more. The face that stared back seemed to mock our efforts with its silent, knowing gaze. Yet I had learned to trust in Holmes's extraordinary abilities. If anyone could unravel the mystery of the girl who drew her killer, it would be my remarkable friend, though I suspected the path to truth would prove far more labyrinthine than any of us yet imagined. The morning fog had begun its reluctant retreat as Holmes conducted his second, more methodical examination of Miss Rowan's studio. Where his initial survey had been broad and comprehensive, this investigation proceeded with the precision of a surgeon's blade, each detail scrutinized and catalogued with that peculiar intensity that marked my friend when he sensed the proximity of truth, the silent testimony of objects. Holmes began with the victim herself, kneeling beside Miss Rowan with the profound respect of one seeking to understand a final message. His examination of her hands revealed not only the expected charcoal residue beneath her nails, but a subtle detail that had escaped our earlier notice. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of London awakening beyond the window. "The faint indentation here, on the side of her ring finger. A ring was worn recently, removed not by the deceased herself, for the skin shows smooth compression rather than the puckered distortion that accompanies forcible removal, but by another hand, and with considerable care. A lover's token, perhaps, I suggested. Perhaps, or perhaps something more significant. Holmes rose and turned his attention to the easel, circling it with the measured pace of a predator studying its prey. The lighting in this portrait continues to intrigue me. French charcoal, Watson. Observe the deep, velvety blacks, the luminous quality of the highlights. This is not the common compressed charcoal found in any art shop, but the superior variety from the forest of Fontainebleau, prized by serious artists and undoubtedly part of that mysterious package from Giraud and Fils. He moved to examine the small table laden with art supplies, his long fingers sorting through tubes of paint and sketching materials with practiced efficiency. Yet here we encounter our first significant anomaly. Miss Rowan's sketchbook contains landscapes, still lifes, architectural studies, all of exceptional quality, but no preliminary sketches of any male figure resembling our subject. An artist of her caliber would typically execute several studies before attempting such a detailed portrait, unless she was working from life, with the subject present, Lestrade interjected. Precisely, Inspector. Or from a very clear recent image, perhaps one captured by mechanical means. Holmes had discovered something among the scattered papers that caused his eyes to brighten with that familiar spark of recognition. Drawing out the writing table's blotter, he placed it where the oblique light from the window fell across its surface. With a soft pencil held nearly horizontal, he began to shade in long, delicate strokes. Like spirits summoned by a medium's incantation, letters began to appear. Giraud and Fils at the head of a note, followed by a list that included papier charbon, chambre claire, and porte crayon. Chambre claire, Holmes repeated softly. A camera lucida, a neat little prism device that allows an artist to trace with unprecedented accuracy. Miss Rowan had recently acquired the means to translate reality to paper with mechanical precision. The certainty of line in that portrait is now partially explained. The rosin trail. Returning to the mantelpiece, Holmes subjected the amber smear to more rigorous analysis, warming it slightly over the dying coals until it released its resinous sweetness. Not the fine rosin used by violinists, as I initially supposed, but the coarser variety employed by cellists and players of larger string instruments. The concentration and placement suggest something was deliberately set, here and then removed. His examination of the doorframe yielded another crucial detail. The brass filings he had detected earlier were not mere dust, but minute particles of metal, fine as powder, yet clearly metallic. These were not present on the outside of the door, only within, near the keyhole. The lock was manipulated from inside the room, Inspector. Yet the key was found in Miss Rowan's pocket. A curious contradiction that lies at the heart of our locked room mystery. The violinist's tale. Our interview with Mr. Ambrose Toller, conducted in his modest quarters below, revealed a man whose nervous energy set his sandy whiskers a-tremble. The room bore all the hallmarks of a struggling musician: scattered sheet music, a violin in a cracked case, and upon the mantel a cake of rosin beside a bottle of cheap cologne whose stopper had left a sticky rim upon the glass. "Inspector, gentlemen," Toller blurted, his long fingers worrying at each other. "Mrs. Battersby told me of this shocking business. Miss Rowan was no trouble at all. Quiet as a mouse, the poor creature." Holmes's glance had already catalogued the man's appearance with quartermaster-like thoroughness. Toller was of middle years, fair-complexioned, with a coarse, close-cropped beard and the sallow complexion of one who spent his days indoors. The sweetish odor we had detected in the upper room was present here as well, though overlaid by the resinous tang of his profession. "You were at home last evening?" Lestrade inquired in his characteristic blunt manner. "At the Empire, sir. The orchestra pit. I can be vouched for by Mr. Hargreaves, the conductor, and by half a dozen fellows who shared. The omnibus home. Left just after 11, I did." Holmes had drifted to the mantel during this exchange, lifting the cologne bottle to sample its contents. Opopanax, he observed, a popular scent among theatrical folk since the French houses began the fashion. Do you have much commerce with the stage, Mr. Toller? The Empire engages the same musicians as the legitimate theatres on occasion, Toller replied with a shamefaced laugh. One acquires the habits of the profession. It's cheap stuff, sir, but the ladies in the gallery appreciate a fellow who smells pleasantly. Did you ever observe visitors calling upon Miss Rowan? I asked. Toller's brow furrowed in concentration. A gentleman? Not to my knowledge, though some 3 weeks past there was a foreign-looking fellow. Continental cut to his coat, low-crowned hat, distinctly un-English. He carried a peculiar perfume that made the entire stairwell smell like a penny fair. I encountered him ascending as I descended. He bore a leather portfolio under his arm, flat like an artist's case. His appearance? Holmes pressed. His face was shadowed by his hat brim, sir. I could observe only that he was not young, though his chin appeared smooth-shaven. The artist's philosophy. Our subsequent visit to the Slade School provided crucial insights into Miss Rowan's recent preoccupations. Professor Hartwell, her principal instructor, painted a picture of a gifted student who had recently achieved a breakthrough in what she termed psychological portraiture. She spoke of having encountered a continental master who had shared certain secrets of technique, he explained as we stood in the light-filled studio. She was excited by the possibilities this knowledge might open, yet troubled by its implications. Professor, she asked me just last week, what if one possesses the power to expose the darkness hidden in the human soul? Does the artist have a duty to reveal such truths, regardless of the consequences? Miss Catherine Pemberton, Lydia's closest friend among the students, provided additional details that sent a chill through my heart. She had been working on what she called her grand experiment, a portrait demonstrating the full extent of her new technique. She seemed both excited and frightened by what she was attempting. Speaking of having attracted the attention of someone she called the subject, a man who had commissioned a portrait yet filled her with inexplicable dread. She mentioned feeling watched, Miss Pemberton continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A man in a dark coat who seemed to vanish whenever she attempted to get a clear look at him. She wondered if her mysterious patron had set someone to observe her progress. The emerging pattern. As our hansom carried us back through the clearing London streets, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp features etched against the pale autumn light. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of dawning comprehension. We are not dealing with a common criminal, Watson, but with someone whose very existence depends upon maintaining a carefully constructed facade. Miss Rowan had developed the ability to see through the masks that people wear, to perceive their true nature and render it visible through her art. Such a gift would be invaluable to those seeking truth, and deadly dangerous to those with secrets to hide. He paused, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the distance. The locked room, the careful positioning of evidence, the portrait itself, all suggest a mind of considerable cunning. Our killer did not merely silence Miss Rowan. He orchestrated the entire scene to serve his purposes. The question that remains is whether that final portrait represents his ultimate defeat or his most elaborate victory. The fog had lifted entirely by the time we reached Baker Street, revealing a London bright with autumn sunshine. Yet despite the cheerful aspect of the day, I could not dispel the growing conviction that we were pursuing a quarry far more dangerous than any common murderer. Someone who killed not for gain, but to preserve the most precious commodity of all, the secret of his true identity. The game, as Holmes would say, had taken on dimensions none of us had yet fully comprehended. The morning after our return from Montague Place found Holmes in a state of brisk, almost feverish activity. Before I had finished my first cup of tea, he had already dispatched 2 telegrams. one to a heraldic stationer in the Strand, another to his trusted jeweller in Hatton Garden, along with 3 brief notes to the Slade School, the Empire's conductor, and the Charing Cross Photographic Society regarding the supply of camera lucida prisms. Wiggins, ever the loyal lieutenant of Holmes's irregular army, was sent to canvass the city's theatrical costumiers and scent merchants in search of anyone lately enamored of the French perfume, Opopanax. By noon, the currents of London intelligence began to swirl back toward Baker Street. Lestrade, who had planted himself at our hearth with bulldog resolve, was quick to pounce upon each new scrap of evidence. "Here is your Griffin rampant," he declared, waving a letter from the Strand. "The signet appears in the arms of Staniforth of Rydal and Fenwick of Brough. And look here, Levy of Hatton Garden has resized a Griffin signet for Captain Percival Staniforth, late of the 17th Lancers, whose chambers are in Jermyn Street." Holmes, pipe in hand, simply nodded. "And the details of the ring? Any sign of the crescent scar?" Lestrade flourished a second note. "The captain bears a crescent scar on his left temple, cropped hair, and a reputation for gambling debts. He's been seen among young artists of the Grosvenor. It's a straight line from him to Miss Rowan's studio." "Let us see if the line holds under scrutiny," Holmes replied, and we set off for Jermyn Street. Captain Staniforth received us in chambers that spoke of better days, field trophies, polo mallets, and a modest pyramid of unpaid bills. He was every inch the military man. The crescent scar was clear, his hair close cropped, and a gold signet with a Griffin rampant adorned his right hand. "Yes, I sat for Miss Rowan thrice," he admitted. "She was to gift the portrait to my godmother. As for last night, I was at the Cavalry Club until nearly midnight. Ask the steward if you doubt me." Lestrade, barely containing his triumph, asked for the ring, which Staniforth surrendered with a flourish. Lestrade examined it, declaring it a perfect match to the portrait. Holmes, however, remained inscrutable, and as we left, he murmured, "Too perfect, Watson. The very clarity of the image demands caution." No sooner had we returned than Lestrade pressed for Staniforth's arrest, but Holmes demurred. "Vanity will keep him in place, Inspector. Give me until evening." As Lestrade wavered between pride and frustration, a fresh note arrived concerning another possible suspect. Lord Ashworth, a nobleman of military bearing who had also commissioned Miss Rowan and was said to possess a scar and a lion rampant crest. Lestrade's eyes shone with the thrill of a new chase. "He fits the bill, Mr. Holmes. I have men on their way to Mayfair now." Holmes, however, only pursed his lips. A lion rampant is hardly a griffin. A riding scar is not a crescent. Miss Rowan's portrait is too precise for such errors. The match is superficial, designed perhaps to ensnare the unwary. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a thick envelope. Dr. Morrison's report from the mortuary. Holmes slit it open and read aloud. "The amber substance on the mantelpiece is a blend of spruce and larch rosin used for cello bows. The brass filings are of a type used in scientific instruments, not keys. The fiber in the ring mark is a fine indigo silk, almost gossamer, hardly a material favored by either Staniforth or Ashworth." Lestrade's certainty ebbed. "What does it mean, Holmes?" "It means, Inspector, that our killer is neither so obvious nor so careless as we have been led to believe. The evidence is arranged with too much art." Just then, Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, a foreign gentleman. Monsieur Auguste Durand entered, his continental coat and the faint scent of a Popanax marking him as the same presence detected in Montague Place. Durand, an instructor in psychological portraiture, revealed he had taught Miss Rowan advanced techniques and supplied her with specialized materials. He produced a packet of her letters in which she described a mysterious patron with a military bearing, a scar, and a signet ring. Yet she also expressed mounting fear and a belief that she had discovered something dangerous in her subject. "She hid a second work," Durand explained. "An insurance, she said, against the eyesire darkness she had unveiled." Holmes, now fully engaged, turned his magnifying lens to the portrait once more. Under his scrutiny, faint architectural lines and scraps of foreign text emerged in the shaded background. A palimpsest, a code hidden in plain sight. "Watson, she has created not just a likeness, but an encoded confession," Holmes breathed. "Our task now is to decipher her message before the killer realizes the extent of her genius." As the afternoon sun slanted through Baker Street, I realized with a shiver that the game had become more intricate than any before. Lestrade, chastened, agreed to delay any arrest. Holmes, energized, was already tracing the next step. A chase through not just the streets of London, but through the shadows and secrets Miss Rowan had captured in her final, fatal work. Thus the case, which had seemed settled, broke open anew. Its center not a suspect, but a cipher. The truth, it was clear, would demand every ounce of Holmes's logic and every brushstroke of Miss Rowan's haunted genius. The afternoon light streaming through our Baker Street windows cast sharp shadows across the charcoal portrait as Holmes subjected it to his most rigorous analysis yet. Armed with his most powerful magnifying lens and a jeweler's loupe borrowed from our earlier expedition, he had spent the better part of 2 hours examining every line, every shadow, every subtle gradation of the drawing with the intensity of a medieval scholar deciphering an ancient manuscript. The technical revelation. "Watson," Holmes said at length, his voice carrying that particular note of suppressed excitement I had learned to associate with breakthrough moments, "observe the precision of this work. Note the steadiness of line, the careful modulation of tone, the absolute accuracy of proportion. This is not the hurried sketch of a woman in mortal terror, but the deliberate creation of an artist working under controlled conditions." I leaned closer, though the subtleties he perceived remained largely opaque to my untrained eye. Surely, even under duress, an artist of Miss Rowan's caliber might maintain such precision. Consider the camera lucida, my dear fellow. Monsieur Durand's revelation of its recent acquisition is crucial to our understanding. This device projects an image onto paper through a prism, allowing the artist to trace with mechanical accuracy. Yet such precision requires absolute stillness from both artist and subject, steady lighting, and considerable time for proper execution. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his sharp profile etched against the afternoon light. "Dr. Morrison's examination places Miss Rowan's death between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. Mrs. Battersby heard normal movement in the studio until that time. The charcoal was still warm when discovered, yet this portrait represents hours of careful work, not minutes of desperate creation." Lestrade, who had been growing increasingly restless during this technical exposition, burst forth with characteristic bluntness. "What are you suggesting, Holmes? That she drew the portrait earlier?" "I am suggesting, Inspector, that the entire narrative we have constructed, the girl who drew her killer with her dying breath, is an elaborate deception. The locked room, the key in her pocket, the pristine crime scene, the perfectly executed portrait, all elements of a carefully staged tableau designed to mislead us toward predetermined conclusions." The hidden evidence. Holmes returned to the portrait with renewed purpose, this time examining not merely the surface, but the mounting itself. With delicate precision, he began to separate the charcoal paper from its wooden backing, revealing what lay beneath. "Observe, gentlemen," he said softly, exposing a second, smaller sheet of paper affixed to the board itself. This sketch, executed in coarser charcoal with hurried, desperate strokes, depicted the same subject, but in drastically different circumstances. The man's features, though recognizable, were contorted with malevolent satisfaction, and in his hand he held not a signet ring, but a small glass vial. "Here," Holmes continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is Miss Rowan's true final message, hidden beneath the elaborate deception her killer forced her to create. She managed to record the actual method of her murder." I studied the crude sketch with growing horror. Poison? Chloral hydrate, most likely, administered to render her compliant while the scene was arranged. The lack of struggle, the composed positioning of the body, the absence of defensive wounds, all explained by chemical restraint rather than physical overpowering. Mrs. Hudson's recognition. At that moment, our landlady appeared with the afternoon post, her entrance providing an unexpected revelation. Upon seeing the newly discovered sketch, her normally composed features registered unmistakable recognition. "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said sharply, "you have seen this face before." "Not precisely this face, Mr. Holmes, but there was a gentleman who called some weeks past, inquiring about your consultation services. He bore a resemblance, though he was clean-shaven and spoke with refined accents. There was something about his eyes, however. They seemed to catalogue everything while revealing nothing of his own thoughts." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. "His manner of dress?" "Continental, sir. His coat was cut shorter than our English fashion, and he wore that same sweetish scent I detected in your rooms yesterday when you returned from Montague Place. The staged deception." Holmes began pacing the length of our sitting room, his movements sharp and decisive. "The brass filings found near the keyhole. Watson, they were not produced by normal use of a key, but by the deliberate manipulation of the lock mechanism from within. Our killer possessed sufficient technical knowledge to create the appearance of a locked room while ensuring his own escape route. But the window was secured from inside," Lestrade protested. "Indeed, because he departed through the door, having arranged the lock to appear fastened from within while actually permitting external manipulation. The indigo silk fiber found at the scene was not from the murder weapon, but from the fine cord used to operate this mechanical deception." Holmes paused before the fireplace, his grey eyes blazing with the intensity of complete comprehension. "Miss Rowan was commissioned to create the elaborate portrait. Perhaps told it was for a wealthy patron who valued anonymity. She used her new camera, Lucida, to achieve the precise detail her client demanded. But in the process, she discovered something that made her realize the true nature of her patron. The killer's identity. The rosine upon the mantelpiece, the opopanax scent, the continental manner of dress. Our killer moves freely through London's artistic and musical communities, using his knowledge of their habits and haunts to establish alibis and misdirect suspicion. He is not Captain Staniforth nor Lord Ashworth, but someone who has studied them both sufficiently to create a composite identity that would satisfy cursory investigation. Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew a sheet of paper upon which he began sketching with rapid, sure strokes. "The true portrait, Watson, would show not the face we have been shown, but features carefully altered through theatrical arts. False whiskers removed, scars concealed, hair styled differently. Our killer is an actor, a master of disguise who has used Miss Rowan's artistic skill to create his own perfect alibi." Setting the trap. "Inspector," Holmes continued, his voice now crisp with authority, "you will place discreet surveillance upon the Empire Theatre, particularly the musician's entrance. Our quarry believes his deception has succeeded, but he will be compelled to verify that the false trail has been followed. Vanity and the need for confirmation will draw him back to observe the results of his handiwork." Lestrade nodded eagerly. "And the portrait?" "Will be displayed prominently at Scotland Yard, with word leaked to the press that Captain Staniforth's arrest is imminent. Our killer will wish to witness the culmination of his elaborate scheme." Holmes smiled grimly. "But he will find instead that Sherlock Holmes has prepared a performance of his own." As evening approached and the gas lamps flickered to life along Baker Street, I could not shake the conviction that we were dealing with a mind of extraordinary cunning, one that had transformed murder into theatrical performance and nearly succeeded in making us unwitting players in his deadly drama. Yet Holmes's revelation of the stage deception had turned the tables, and the hunter was about to become the hunted. The game, as my remarkable friend would say, had reached its most dangerous phase, where truth and deception danced together in the shadows. and only the keenest intellect could distinguish between the mask and the face beneath. The hours following Holmes's revelation of the staged deception were marked by a restless energy that seemed to permeate every corner of our Baker Street lodgings. My friend, typically so composed in his moments of greatest intellectual triumph, exhibited an uncharacteristic agitation that manifested itself in abrupt movements, abandoned musical phrases scraped from his violin, and a series of seemingly disconnected preparations that gradually revealed their underlying purpose. The killer's bold stroke. Our morning was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless constable bearing news that sent Holmes into immediate action. During the pre-dawn hours, an attempt had been made to breach the evidence room at Scotland Yard itself. The night watchman, old Jenkins, had detected the subtle scratching of metal upon metal, not the crude work of a common burglar, but the precise manipulation of someone intimately familiar with lock mechanisms. "He grows desperate," Holmes observed, examining the scene with his characteristic intensity. The brass filings scattered near the evidence room door matched precisely those found in Miss Rowan's studio, the same fine, crescent-shaped particles that spoke of specialized tools and practiced hands. More significant still was the object left behind in the intruder's hasty retreat. A miniature camera, lucida of exquisite craftsmanship, its brass fittings gleaming with the precision of scientific instrumentation. Holmes held the device to the light, his gray eyes blazing with comprehension. "He came not merely to destroy evidence, Watson, but to document it. Observe the modifications. This is no artist's tool, but an instrument of espionage, designed for the clandestine copying of documents and drawings. Our killer is indeed a man who deals in images and illusions, but his artistry extends far beyond the conventional canvas." The web expands. The day brought a cascade of incidents that revealed the full extent of our adversary's network and his growing panic. Monsieur Durand's lodgings in Great Portland Street had been ransacked during the night, the Frenchman left insensible with a head wound while his correspondence was systematically rifled. The attack bore all the hallmarks of our killer's methodology. The sweet scent of a Popanax lingering in the air, the precise application of violence sufficient to incapacitate but not kill, and the methodical search for specific documents. Among the scattered papers, Holmes discovered fragments of a letter that had escaped the flames, references to psychological portraiture techniques, and the dangerous knowledge that art can reveal. Most significantly, there was a mention of a second commission, another portrait that Miss Rowan had undertaken in secret, hidden away as what she termed her insurance against the darkness. "He seeks to eliminate not merely the evidence of his crime," Holmes explained as we examined the scene, "but any record of his true identity. Miss Rowan discovered something in the course of her work, something that threatened the very foundation of his carefully constructed existence." The theatrical connection. Our investigation led us next to the Empire Theatre, where Holmes's inquiries among the musicians revealed a pattern of subtle manipulation that spoke to our killer's theatrical background. Several members of the orchestra reported encounters with a gentleman of continental appearance who had shown unusual interest in their schedules, their routes home, and their personal circumstances. "He has been building alibis and gathering intelligence for weeks," Holmes observed. "Each musician, each artist, each member of London's creative community becomes a potential tool in his elaborate deception." The theatre's costume department yielded further revelations. A wig-maker recalled preparing a set of false whiskers and a theatrical scar for a gentleman who claimed to be preparing for amateur theatricals. The description matched neither Captain Staniforth nor any of our suspected figures, but rather suggested someone skilled in the arts of disguise and transformation. The surveillance. As evening approached, Holmes orchestrated a careful surveillance operation designed to draw our quarry into the open. Word was strategically leaked that the hidden evidence from Miss Rowan's studio would be presented to senior officials at Scotland Yard, displayed in a room whose windows overlooked the narrow alleyway where our killer might observe undetected. Holmes positioned himself across the street, transformed by his arts of disguise into an unremarkable gentleman of scholarly appearance. His patience was rewarded when a figure emerged from the gathering fog, a man whose careful anonymity spoke volumes about his true nature. "There," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible above the rumble of evening traffic. "Note the deliberate ordinariness of his dress, the way he positions himself to observe while appearing to read his newspaper. This is invisibility raised to the level of art." The chase through London. Our quarry's movements led us on a circuitous route through the fog-shrouded streets of London, from the Strand to Leicester Square, through the theatrical district where his knowledge of hidden passages and back entrances became apparent. He moved with the confidence of one intimately familiar with the city's secret geography, yet Holmes's superior knowledge of London's labyrinthine ways kept us always within striking distance. The chase culminated near the Thames embankment, where our mysterious figure met briefly with another man, a hurried exchange of words and what appeared to be a small package before both melted back into the concealing mist. "He maintains a network," Holmes observed, as we lost sight of our quarry among the river stairs. "This is not the work of a single individual, but of someone who has cultivated assistance throughout London's artistic and criminal underworld." The technical revelation. Our return to Baker Street brought a crucial breakthrough. Holmes's analysis of the miniature camera lucida revealed modifications that spoke to its true purpose. Not merely artistic aid, but a device for the precise copying of documents and the creation of false evidence. Hidden within its brass fittings were traces of the same indigo silk that had appeared at each crime scene. "He has been preparing for this eventuality for months," Holmes explained, his voice carrying that note of grudging admiration he reserved for worthy adversaries. "Every element of his plan includes contingencies, alternative narratives, escape routes. We are dealing with a mind of extraordinary cunning, one that has transformed murder into performance art." The gathering storm. As the fog thickened beyond our windows, Holmes stood in contemplative silence, his sharp profile etched against the gaslight. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of dawning comprehension. "Our killer has revealed himself through his very desperation, Watson. The break-in at Scotland Yard, the attack on Durand, the systematic elimination of witnesses. These are not the actions of a man confident in his deception, but of one who realizes that his elaborate fiction is beginning to unravel." He turned from the window, his eyes blazing with that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with the approach of truth. "He knows that I have seen through his primary illusion. Now he seeks to create new deceptions, new false trails, new scapegoats. But in doing so, he reveals the very desperation that will prove his undoing." The final preparation. The evening brought word that Captain Staniforth had been attacked in Duke Street, a theatrical near strangulation with silk cord that bore all the hallmarks of our killer's methodology. Yet the assault had been carefully staged to ensure witnesses and a dramatic escape, designed to reinforce the false narrative while eliminating the inconvenient reality of Staniforth's innocence. "He plays to the gallery even now," Holmes observed with grim satisfaction. "But tomorrow, Watson, we shall provide him with an audience he does not expect. The final act of this elaborate drama approaches, and I intend to ensure that justice, not artistry, writes the conclusion." As the night deepened and the fog pressed against our windows like the breath of some vast, sleeping creature, I could not shake the conviction that we stood upon the threshold of a confrontation that would test every faculty Holmes possessed. Our adversary had proven himself a master of deception, an artist of murder whose canvas was the very fabric of London society. Yet I had learned to trust in my friend's extraordinary abilities, and if anyone could unravel this web of theatrical deceit, it would be Sherlock Holmes. The game, as he would say, had reached its most critical phase, where truth and illusion danced together in the shadows, and only the keenest intellect could distinguish between the mask and the face beneath. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or disaster, and the fate of justice itself hung in the balance. The grey dawn of October 23rd found Holmes in that state of controlled intensity that I had learned to associate with the final movements of his most complex cases. The events of the previous night, the attempted breach at Scotland Yard, the assault on Monsieur Durand, and the theatrical attack upon Captain Staniforth had revealed our adversary's growing desperation, but also provided Holmes with the crucial insights necessary to penetrate his elaborate deception. The counter-performance. "Our killer has made a fundamental error, Watson," Holmes observed as he stood before our sitting-room window, his sharp profile etched against the pale morning light. In his frantic efforts to preserve his fiction, he has revealed the very theatrical nature that lies at the heart of his methodology. We are not dealing with a continental gentleman of mysterious origins, but with an English actor whose greatest role has been the creation of his own false identity. Holmes had spent the early hours orchestrating what he termed the counter-performance, a carefully staged operation designed to exploit our quarry's greatest weakness, his inability to resist admiring his own handiwork. The plan required precise timing in the cooperation of both Scotland Yard and London's theatrical community. Through his network of contacts, Holmes arranged for word to spread through the city's artistic circles that a special examination of Miss Rowan's final works would take place that evening. The location would be her own studio in Montague Place, where certain overlooked evidence would be presented to senior officials. The bait was irresistible, the opportunity to observe the fruits of his elaborate deception being accepted as truth by the very authorities he had sought to mislead. The technical preparation, Holmes's preparations at the studio, were methodical and ingenious. Working with the precision of a surgeon, he recreated the lock mechanism that had enabled the impossible crime, using his understanding of the brass filings and silk threads to construct a demonstration of the killer's methodology. "Observe, Watson," he said, crouching before the studio door with a collection of delicate instruments. "The lock appears secure from within, yet a narrow spring of tempered steel, no broader than a quill, can be introduced through the keyhole to manipulate the mechanism from outside. A silk cord, finer than spider's thread, provides the necessary tension." He demonstrated the technique with practiced ease, showing how the door could be made to appear locked from within while actually permitting external manipulation. The brass filings we had discovered were the inevitable result of this mechanical deception, left behind by someone who had perfected the technique through repeated practice. More significantly, Holmes prepared what he called his photographic trap, a device of his own invention that combined magnesium powder with a chemical preparation that would reveal fingerprints under specific conditions. Any attempt to handle the supposed overlooked evidence would result in both a brilliant flash of light and the permanent recording of the intruder's identity. The revelation of identity, as evening approached and the fog began its familiar descent upon London streets, Holmes shared with me the crucial deduction that had unlocked the entire mystery. The continental gentleman, the mysterious patron, the foreign accent, all theatrical affectations, Watson. Our killer is Marcus Blackwood, a character actor formerly of the Lyceum Theatre, whose specialty was the complete transformation of his appearance and manner for each role. He was dismissed from several companies for what the management delicately termed inappropriate interest in his fellow performers. Holmes produced a theatrical program from several years past, bearing Blackwood's photograph. The face, though younger and bearing different whiskers, was unmistakably that of our quarry. The same narrow features, the same calculating eyes, the same distinctive notch in the upper ear that no amount of theatrical skill could completely conceal. He has been preparing this elaborate deception for months, studying his intended victims, creating composite identities from real individuals like Captain Staniforth and Lord Ashworth. Miss Rowan's growing skill at psychological portraiture threatened to expose not just his current persona, but his entire network of false identities. The trap springs. Our vigil at Montague Place was rewarded when, just after 9 o'clock, a figure emerged from the fog-shrouded street. He appeared as an elderly gentleman of scholarly appearance, stooped shoulders, flowing whiskers, and the deliberate gait of advanced years. Yet Holmes's trained eye immediately penetrated the disguise. "The way he holds his left shoulder," Holmes whispered, slightly elevated from his portrayal of Richard III some years past. "The theatrical profession leaves its marks upon the body as surely as any other trade." Blackwood entered the building with the confidence of one intimately familiar with its layout, using the very lock mechanism he had employed on the night of the murder. His movements were economical and precise, betraying none of the uncertainty one might expect from a genuine intruder. Inside the studio, he went directly to the mantelpiece, setting down a small instrument, another modified camera lucida prism. His examination of the supposed evidence was methodical, professional, the work of someone cataloguing the success of his own deception. The moment he lifted the carefully prepared document, Holmes's trap was sprung. Light, sudden and white as lightning, blasted through the dim room, accompanied by the sharp hiss of burning magnesium. For that crucial instant, Blackwood's face was laid bare. The false whiskers, the theatrical makeup, the carefully constructed mask of age, all revealed as elaborate fiction. The confrontation. "Marcus Blackwood," Holmes announced, stepping from the shadows with theatrical timing worthy of the man he addressed, late of the Lyceum Theatre, master of disguise, and murderer of Miss Lydia Rowan. Blackwood's response was characteristically dramatic. Rather than flee immediately, he straightened to his full height, the stooped posture falling away like a discarded costume. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured tones of his true breeding, no longer disguised by foreign accent or affected mannerisms. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said with a slight bow, his manner suggesting grudging respect rather than fear. "I confess myself impressed by your deductive abilities. Few have seen through my performances with such clarity. Your greatest role has been the creation of your own identity," Holmes replied, his voice carrying that note of cold authority I had learned to associate with his moments of triumph. Yet even the most skilled actor cannot completely suppress his true nature. Your vanity, your need for recognition, your compulsion to observe the success of your deceptions, these have been your undoing. The escape and pursuit. What followed was a chase through the fog-bound streets of London that demonstrated both Blackwood's intimate knowledge of the city's hidden passages and Holmes's superior understanding of its secret geography. The actor moved with the confidence of one who had rehearsed every escape route, yet Holmes's relentless pursuit gradually narrowed the possibilities. The confrontation culminated near the Thames Embankment, where Blackwood's network of theatrical associates had prepared a final escape route. Yet Holmes's preparations proved superior, and though our quarry managed to slip away into the concealing mist, he left behind crucial evidence. Not merely the modified camera lucida, but fingerprints preserved by Holmes's chemical preparation and a clear understanding of his methods and identity. The gathering evidence. As we returned to Baker Street through the fog-shrouded streets, Holmes catalogued the evening's revelations with satisfaction. We have established his true identity, documented his methodology, and forced him to abandon his carefully constructed personas. Most importantly, we have demonstrated that his impossible crime was nothing more than an elaborate theatrical performance. The evidence recovered from the studio, the fingerprints, the modified instruments, the theatrical paraphernalia, would prove sufficient to expose Blackwood's network and reveal the full extent of his deceptions. Yet Holmes's expression carried a note of concern that suggested the game was not yet concluded. "He will not attempt the same deception twice, Watson. Having been exposed, he will seek to create new identities, new escape routes, new performances. The final act of this drama approaches, and I suspect it will test every faculty we possess." as the fog pressed against our windows and the gas lamps flickered in the night. I could not shake the conviction that we had achieved a significant victory while simultaneously awakening a more dangerous adversary. Marcus Blackwood, stripped of his elaborate disguises, would prove far more formidable as a cornered and desperate man than he had ever been as a hidden puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows. The case of the girl who drew her killer had taken on dimensions none of us had fully anticipated, and the revelation of our adversary's true nature suggested that the final confrontation would demand every ounce of Holmes's extraordinary abilities. The game, as he would say, had reached its most critical phase, where the distinction between hunter and hunted would be determined by wit, courage, and the inexorable pursuit of justice. The pale October dawn found Holmes in that state of controlled intensity that I had learned to associate with the final movements of his most intricate cases. He sat before Miss Rowan's charcoal portrait, which had been carefully repositioned to catch the oblique morning light streaming through our Baker Street windows. In his hands, he held the miniature camera Lucida recovered from our confrontation with Blackwood, not merely examining it, but employing it as the artist herself had done. The hidden revelation. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice carrying that note of suppressed excitement I knew so well, "observe what Miss Rowan has truly left us." He adjusted the prism device with surgical precision, angling it until the light fell across the portrait in exactly the manner she had intended. At first, I perceived nothing beyond the familiar sweep of charcoal and shadow. Then, as Holmes made minute adjustments to both angle and distance, the cross-hatching began to reveal its deeper purpose. Faint architectural lines emerged from what I had taken for mere background shading, the suggestion of columns, a modest pediment, and most remarkably, the helmeted profile of a classical figure. "Minerva," I breathed, recognizing the goddess of wisdom whose plaster likeness presided over the landing at Montague Place. Indeed. And observe here, Holmes indicated barely perceptible marks that became visible only under the precise optical conditions. Letters, traced not with charcoal, but with the natural oils of her fingertips, invisible except when viewed through her camera, Lucida, at the proper angle. P-A-L-A-S. The revelation struck me with the force of divine inspiration. She has told us exactly where to look for her true evidence. Miss Rowan possessed not merely artistic skill, but the strategic mind of a general under siege. Knowing her life was in danger, she prepared multiple lines of defense, the obvious portrait to satisfy her killer's demands, and this hidden message to guide us to her real testament. The goddess yields her secret. Within the hour, we had returned to Montague Place, where Mrs. Battersby awaited us with the patient resignation of one who had endured too much tragedy to be surprised by further revelations. The cracked plaster bust of Minerva still presided over the narrow landing, her serene features bearing no hint of the secrets she harbored. Holmes approached the statue with the reverence of an archaeologist examining a priceless artifact. His examination revealed what my untrained eye had missed. The crack that marred the goddess's temple was not the result of age or accident, but had been carefully created to provide access to the hollow interior. With delicate precision, he inserted his penknife into the hairline seam and twisted gently. The entire forward section of the bust, a cleverly fitted shell, separated to reveal the cavity within. Nestled inside lay a roll of heavy paper bound with the same indigo silk we had encountered throughout our investigation. "Our gossamer thread," Holmes observed with grim satisfaction. Miss Rowan worked under her murderer's very supervision, yet found the courage and cunning to preserve the truth. The triple portrait. The document that Holmes carefully unrolled in the studio proved to be Miss Rowan's masterpiece of detection, rendered in charcoal and determination. Upon a single sheet, she had created 3 overlapping portraits of the same subject, each revealing a different phase of his elaborate deception. The first showed a clean-shaven man of narrow features, with particular attention paid to a distinctive notch in the rim of his right ear, a detail no amount of theatrical skill could completely disguise. The second depicted the same individual transformed by false whiskers, an artificial crescent scar, and close-cropped hair in the military fashion. The third showed the ultimate disguise. Age added through masterful shading, stooped posture suggested through subtle line work, and the scholarly beard that had nearly deceived us all. In the margin, Miss Rowan had written in her precise hand, "The same eyes always. Watch the ear. Nature's signature cannot be counterfeited." "That," Holmes said quietly, "represents an artist's sworn testimony more reliable than any witness's account." The network exposed our study of this remarkable document was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector MacDonald, bearing intelligence that revealed the full scope of Blackwood's criminal enterprise. The theatrical murderer had not worked alone, but commanded a network of associates throughout London's artistic community. Costume makers who specialized in complete physical transformation, theatrical chemists who could provide exotic poisons, and criminal specialists who handled the technical aspects of his elaborate deceptions. "The man we've been pursuing," MacDonald explained, "has been operating under at least 7 different identities across 3 countries. Each persona was so complete that continental police forces treated them as separate individuals. Miss Rowan threatened to expose not just one murderer, but an entire criminal organization built upon the foundation of theatrical deception." Holmes nodded grimly. Her psychological portraiture could penetrate any disguise, see through any performance to the essential character beneath. For a man whose very existence depended upon maintaining false identities, she represented an existential threat. The killer's desperation. Even as we examined Miss Rowan's hidden evidence, word arrived that demonstrated Blackwood's growing desperation. The night watchman at Scotland Yard, poor Jenkins, who had detected the earlier break-in attempt, had been found strangled in an alley behind the station. The method bore all the hallmarks of our quarry's work: the silk cord, the precise application of force, and the lingering scent of a Paarthurnax that marked his presence like a calling card. More ominously, Wiggins burst into the studio with news that a man matching Blackwood's description had been observed near the building with a container of paraffin. The sweet, cloying scent that had masked the fuel's odor was already beginning to seep through the floorboards. "He seeks to destroy the scene of his greatest deception," Holmes observed, his voice sharp with urgency. "If we cannot capture him, he will at least ensure that no evidence remains to contradict his carefully constructed narrative." The race against fire. What followed was a desperate evacuation as Holmes coordinated the removal of crucial evidence while the building filled with the acrid smoke of Blackwood's arson. The killer had prepared his incendiary device with the same theatrical precision that marked all his work. Oil-soaked rags positioned behind the skirting boards, paraffin threaded along the cracks between floorboards, and multiple ignition points designed to create maximum destruction with minimal risk to surrounding properties. Yet even in this moment of apparent triumph, Blackwood's vanity proved his weakness. Rather than flee immediately after setting his fires, he lingered in the shadows across the street, compelled to witness the destruction of the evidence that threatened his elaborate fiction. It was this need to observe the success of his own performance that provided Holmes with the opportunity he required. The final gambit. As the fire brigade arrived and began their battle against the flames, Holmes implemented what he later described as the ultimate theatrical trap. Using his own considerable skills at disguise, he positioned himself among the crowd of onlookers, knowing that Blackwood's compulsive need to witness his handiwork would draw him close enough for identification. The strategy succeeded when a distinguished elderly gentleman approached the scene with the confident manner of one observing a performance rather than a tragedy. His examination of the fire's progress was too knowing, too professional. the behavior of someone intimately familiar with the building's layout and the location of the evidence he sought to destroy. Professor Heinrich Zimmermann of the Vienna Academy, Holmes announced, stepping from the crowd with theatrical timing worthy of his adversary. Or should I say, Marcus Blackwood, master of disguise and destroyer of innocence. The moment of truth. Blackwood's response revealed both his theatrical brilliance and his ultimate defeat. Rather than attempt denial or flight, he straightened to his full height and offered a bow that acknowledged both his exposure and his grudging respect for Holmes's deductive abilities. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said in cultured tones now free of any foreign affectation, "I confess myself genuinely impressed. You have seen through disguises that have deceived police forces across Europe. I salute your superior artistry. Your artistry, Mr. Blackwood, has been devoted to deception and murder. Miss Rowan's only crime was possessing the skill to see through your performances to the darkness beneath." As the flames behind us cast dancing shadows across the fog-shrouded street, I realized that we had witnessed something unprecedented in our long association. Not merely the solution of a crime, but the defeat of an artist whose medium had been murder itself. Miss Rowan's final testament, preserved through courage and cunning, had spoken with a voice that no amount of theatrical skill could silence. The case of the girl who drew her killer had revealed its deepest truth. She had indeed captured her murderer's likeness, not in the desperate moments of her death, but through the patient accumulation of artistic insight that had ultimately exposed his true nature. Her art had triumphed over his, and justice would be served through the marriage of creative vision and deductive reasoning. The game, as Holmes would say, had reached its penultimate movement, with only the final act remaining to bring this extraordinary drama to its proper conclusion. The grey October evening had settled upon London with the weight of impending revelation when Holmes received the message that would precipitate our final confrontation with Marcus Blackwood. It arrived not through conventional channels, but in the form of a small advertisement placed in the evening edition of The Times, an innocuous notice announcing a special exhibition of psychological portraiture at a private gallery in Bloomsbury, to be held that very night. The bait accepted. "Observe the typography, Watson," Holmes said, holding the newspaper to the gaslight. "The spacing between letters, the particular font selection. This was set by someone intimately familiar with theatrical printing. Our Mr. Blackwood cannot resist the opportunity to witness the reception of his masterwork, even knowing it may lead to his capture." The advertisement was a masterpiece of subtle provocation, designed to appeal to Blackwood's vanity, while appearing to offer him the perfect opportunity to gauge the success of his elaborate deception. Holmes had orchestrated its placement through his network of contacts, knowing that the actor's compulsive need to observe his own performance would override his instinct for self-preservation. As we prepared to depart Baker Street, Holmes revealed the full scope of his preparations. "Lestrade has positioned men at every exit of the gallery. MacDonald's officers watch the surrounding streets, yet I suspect our quarry will not attempt a conventional escape. His theatrical nature demands a more dramatic conclusion." The Gallery of Deceptions. The private gallery in Bloomsbury proved to be a narrow, gaslit establishment whose walls bore an eclectic collection of portraits and landscapes. The proprietor, a nervous gentleman named Ashworth, had been persuaded to cooperate through a combination of civic duty and financial incentive. The centerpiece of the evening's exhibition was Miss Rowan's charcoal portrait, displayed prominently beneath a calcium light that rendered every detail with stark clarity. Holmes positioned himself near the entrance, transformed by his arts of disguise into an elderly art collector of distinguished appearance. I took my station across the room, where I could observe both the portrait and the various patrons who drifted through the gallery's modest chambers. The atmosphere was charged with expectation, though most of the genuine visitors remained unaware that they were witnessing the final act of a deadly drama. The first indication of Blackwood's presence came not through sight, but through that distinctive sweetish scent of opopanax that had marked his appearances throughout our investigation. A distinguished gentleman of middle years entered the gallery, his continental coat and scholarly manner immediately familiar despite the subtle alterations to his appearance. He moved with the confident ease of one examining artwork, yet his attention remained fixed upon Miss Rowan's portrait with an intensity that betrayed his true interest. The confrontation. Holmes allowed Blackwood to study the portrait for several minutes, observing as the actor's professional eye catalogued every detail of his own handiwork. When he finally approached, it was with the measured pace of a critic offering aesthetic judgment. "A remarkable piece," Holmes observed in the cultured tones of his assumed identity. "The artist has captured something beyond mere physical likeness. There is a quality of psychological penetration that speaks to extraordinary skill." Blackwood turned, and for a moment his carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing the sharp intelligence beneath. "Indeed," he replied, his voice carrying only the faintest trace of foreign accent. "The young lady possessed a rare gift for seeing through the surfaces that people present to the world, a dangerous talent in some circumstances." "Dangerous?" Holmes inquired with apparent innocence. "Surely art serves only to illuminate truth." "Truth," Blackwood said with a slight smile that held no warmth, "is often the most dangerous commodity of all. There are those who would kill to prevent its revelation." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Holmes straightened slightly, allowing his own disguise to fall away with theatrical precision. "Then perhaps it is fortunate, Mr. Marcus Blackwood, that truth has found such skilled advocates." The revelation unfolds. Blackwood's response to his exposure revealed the full extent of his theatrical training. Rather than flee or deny, he acknowledged Holmes's superior deduction with a bow that managed to convey both respect and defiance. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice now free of any foreign affectation, "I confess myself genuinely impressed. You have penetrated disguises that have deceived police forces across Europe." "Your artistry was formidable," Holmes replied, "but ultimately flawed. Miss Rowan's psychological portraiture revealed what no amount of theatrical skill could conceal, the essential darkness of your character." As if summoned by these words, Lestrade and his men emerged from their concealment, surrounding our quarry with professional efficiency. Yet even faced with capture, Blackwood maintained his theatrical composure. "The performance is not yet concluded," he announced with dramatic flourish. "You have solved the mystery of Miss Rowan's murder, but you have barely glimpsed the larger stage upon which this drama has been enacted. The complete deception." Exposed with Blackwood secured, Holmes proceeded to reveal the full scope of the actor's elaborate deception to the assembled company. Using the portrait as his text, he demonstrated how each element of the supposed impossible crime had been carefully constructed to mislead investigation. "The locked room was achieved through mechanical means," Holmes explained, producing the delicate spring device recovered from Blackwood's effects. "This instrument, inserted through the keyhole, could manipulate the lock mechanism from outside while leaving the key in the victim's pocket. The brass filings we discovered were the inevitable result of this technique." He moved to examine the portrait itself, his magnifying lens revealing details invisible to casual observation. The precision of line, the careful modulation of tone, the absolute accuracy of proportion. These characteristics reveal work completed under controlled conditions, not in the desperate moments before death. Miss Rowan was forced to create this portrait using her camera lucida, then murdered once the work was complete. Yet she managed to outwit her killer even in her final moments. Holmes continued, his voice carrying deep admiration for the murdered artist. The hidden message encoded in the portrait's background, the evidence concealed within Minerva's hollow interior, the triple portrait showing Blackwood's true features, all accomplished under his very supervision. The network revealed Blackwood's confession, delivered with the dramatic flair of a seasoned performer, revealed a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple murder. He had operated across Europe for nearly a decade, using his theatrical skills to facilitate crimes ranging from art forgery to political assassination. "Artists possess a dangerous gift," he explained with chilling casualness. "They see truth where others perceive only surface." Miss Rowan's technique for revealing character beneath any disguise made her invaluable and, ultimately, intolerable. The network of accomplices included costume makers, chemists, and technical specialists throughout London's artistic community. Each had contributed to what Blackwood termed his grand performance, unaware that they were facilitating murder rather than mere theatrical illusion. The final curtain. As Lestrade's men prepared to escort Blackwood to his cell, the actor made one final attempt at dramatic gesture. With movements so subtle as to be nearly imperceptible, he reached toward a concealed vial of chloral hydrate, the same poison he had used on Miss Rowan. Holmes's intervention was swift and decisive. "Your final performance ends here, Mr. Blackwood. You will face justice for your crimes, not escape through theatrical suicide." Even in defeat, Blackwood's theatrical nature asserted itself. "You have won this engagement, Mr. Holmes," he said with a bow that managed to convey both acknowledgement and warning. "Yet remember that the greatest performances often outlive their creators. The art of deception is immortal." The triumph of truth. As our extraordinary adversary was led away through the fog-shrouded streets of London, Holmes stood in contemplative silence before Miss Rowan's portrait. The young artist's final work seemed to glow with inner light, her psychological insight having triumphed over the most elaborate criminal deception any of us had encountered. "She achieved a form of immortality through her art," Holmes observed quietly. "Her vision penetrated every disguise, exposed every deception, and ultimately ensured that justice would prevail over even the most theatrical evil." The case of the girl who drew her killer had revealed its deepest truth, that artistic vision, when combined with courage and determination, possessed the power to expose any falsehood and defeat any deception. Miss Rowan's final masterpiece was not merely a portrait, but a testament to the eternal struggle between truth and illusion. As we made our way back through the gas-lit streets toward Baker Street, I could not shake the conviction that we had witnessed something unprecedented, not merely the solution of a crime, but the triumph of artistic integrity over criminal artistry. Yet Blackwood's final words haunted me, suggesting that this victory, however complete, might represent only the conclusion of one act in a larger drama whose scope we had yet to fully comprehend. The game, as Holmes would say, was approaching its final movement, with justice preparing to claim its ultimate victory over the most elaborate criminal performance any of us had ever encountered. Yet something in my friend's manner suggested that one crucial revelation remained, one final secret that would complete our understanding of this extraordinary case. The morning after Blackwood's arrest found our Baker Street lodgings transformed into an impromptu tribunal where Holmes had consented to lay bare the complete chain of reasoning that had led from a charcoal portrait to a master criminal in shackles. Inspector Lestrade sat with notebook at the ready, while MacDonald occupied the chair nearest the fire, his weathered features bearing that expression of professional satisfaction that comes with a case well concluded. I had positioned myself where I might observe both Holmes and the evidence he had arranged with characteristic precision upon our center table. "The systematic revelation. Gentlemen," Holmes began, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, "we have witnessed not merely a murder, but a masterpiece of criminal artistry, and its ultimate defeat by genuine artistic vision. Our adversary's greatest strength became his fatal weakness. The very theatrical nature that enabled his elaborate deceptions also compelled him to create a performance so perfect that it revealed its own artifice." He rose and moved to the charcoal portrait, which occupied the place of honor upon our mantelpiece. Let us begin where our investigation began, with the assumption that Miss Rowan drew her killer in her final moments. This assumption, though dramatically appealing, was fundamentally flawed. Observe the certainty of line, the precise modulation of tone, the mechanical accuracy of proportion. These are not the desperate scratchings of a woman in mortal terror, but the deliberate creation of an artist working under controlled conditions with the aid of a camera lucida. Lestrade leaned forward, his notebook forgotten. But the charcoal was still warm when we found her, Holmes. How do you account for that? Elementary, Inspector. The portrait was indeed completed shortly before Miss Rowan's death, but not by her own choice. Blackwood forced her to create this elaborate deception, using her artistic skill to construct his perfect alibi. The warm charcoal merely indicated recent use, not desperate creation. The technical mastery. Holmes moved to the collection of evidence he had assembled, each item tagged and catalogued with scientific precision. The locked room presented our greatest challenge, yet its solution lay in the brass filings we discovered near the keyhole. These were not the rough burrs produced by normal key usage, but the fine powder created by repeated manipulation of a delicate spring mechanism. He produced the slender brass instrument recovered from Blackwood's effects, demonstrating its operation with practiced ease. This device, no broader than a quill, could be inserted through the keyhole to manipulate the lock mechanism from outside. The indigo silk cord provided the necessary tension, while the key remained in Miss Rowan's pocket, creating the perfect illusion of a room sealed from within. MacDonald examined the mechanism with professional interest. Ingenious, but surely such a device would require considerable skill to operate. Indeed, the skill of someone intimately familiar with theatrical machinery. Blackwood's background in stage mechanics served him well in creating his impossible crimes. The Rosine we discovered upon the mantelpiece was not the fine variety used by violinists, but the coarser grade employed by stage technicians to provide grip for pulleys and silk lines. The artistic triumph. Holmes's attention turned to the hidden evidence that had ultimately exposed our quarry. Miss Rowan's true masterpiece was not the obvious portrait, but the triple study concealed within Minerva's hollow interior. Working under her killer's very supervision, she managed to record his essential features through all his theatrical transformations. He displayed the remarkable document, pointing to the subtle details that had escaped casual observation. Note the distinctive notch in the upper ear, nature's signature that no amount of theatrical skill could completely disguise. "Watch the ear," she wrote, and in doing so, provided us with the key to penetrating every disguise Blackwood had created. The psychological insight required for such work, I observed, suggests an artist of extraordinary perception. Precisely, Watson. Miss Rowan had developed what she termed psychological portraiture, the ability to see through surface appearances to the essential character beneath. For a man whose very existence depended upon maintaining false identities, she represented an existential threat. The network exposed Lestrade consulted his notes with evident satisfaction. "The arrests continue, Holmes. We've taken the wig-maker in Maiden Lane, the chemist who supplied his exotic poisons, and half a dozen theatrical costumiers who unknowingly provided his disguises. The scope of his criminal enterprise extends across 3 countries. Blackwood's genius lay not merely in his individual performances, but in his ability to corrupt legitimate artistic endeavors for criminal purposes. Galleries displayed his forgeries, collectors purchased stolen works, and artists were manipulated into serving his schemes without understanding their true purpose." Holmes paused before the window, his sharp profile etched against the morning light. His greatest crime was not murder, Inspector, but the corruption of art itself. He transformed creative expression into an instrument of deception, betraying the very principles that Miss Rowan died defending. The philosophical resolution. As our discussion continued, Holmes revealed the deeper significance of our victory. We have witnessed something unprecedented in criminal investigation, the defeat of elaborate deception by artistic truth. Miss Rowan's vision penetrated every disguise, exposed every falsehood, and ultimately ensured that justice would prevail over even the most theatrical evil. The morning brought news of Blackwood's trial, where his theatrical skills proved inadequate against the accumulated weight of evidence. The prosecution's case relied heavily upon Miss Rowan's hidden testimony, the triple portrait that revealed his true features, the encoded messages that exposed his methods, and the physical evidence that demonstrated the impossibility of his supposed locked-room murder. The jury required less than an hour to reach their verdict, Lestrade reported with grim satisfaction. Guilty on all counts. The judge described Miss Rowan's evidence as the most remarkable testimony he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. The lasting legacy. As the case drew to its formal conclusion, Holmes often returned to contemplate its deeper meanings. Miss Rowan's victory represented more than the triumph of good over evil. It demonstrated the eternal power of artistic truth to expose any deception, no matter how elaborate. She achieved a form of immortality through her art, Holmes observed during one of our evening discussions. Her vision will continue to speak for justice long after we are gone, inspiring future generations of artists to use their gifts in service of truth. The portrait itself was eventually donated to the National Gallery, where it served as both memorial and warning, a reminder that artistic integrity possessed the power to defeat even the most sophisticated criminal deception, the eternal game. Our final visit to Miss Rowan's former studio found it transformed into a memorial to her courage and artistic vision. The building had been purchased by her fellow students at the Slade School, who established a scholarship in her name for young artists dedicated to psychological portraiture and the revelation of truth through art. As we prepared to leave, Mrs. Hudson appeared with the afternoon post, bearing, among other correspondence, a telegram that immediately caught Holmes's attention. His eyes brightened with that familiar spark of intellectual curiosity as he read the brief message. "Watson," he announced, folding the telegram with characteristic precision, "it appears we have been consulted regarding a most peculiar matter in Sussex. A certain ducal household reports that their prize-winning parrot has begun reciting passages from an unknown Elizabethan play while simultaneously pilfering the Duchess's jewels. A most intriguing confluence of circumstances. Would you not agree?" I smiled, recognizing the familiar prelude to our next adventure. "The game, Holmes?" He rose, stretching his long limbs with cat-like grace, that expression of bored resignation already giving way to renewed interest. "The game, my dear Watson, is perpetually afoot. It seems that even the animal kingdom possesses secrets worthy of our attention." As we gathered our coats and prepared to depart for the Sussex Express, Holmes paused for one final glance at the empty studio where Miss Lydia Rowan had fought her last battle against deception. She understood that the greatest art serves not merely aesthetic purposes, but moral ones, he said quietly. Her brush became a weapon in the eternal struggle between truth and falsehood, and her victory will inspire artists for generations to come. The case of the girl who drew her killer had reached its proper conclusion, yet its lessons would endure as long as artists possessed the courage to see through surface appearances to the essential character beneath. In death, Miss Rowan had achieved a victory more complete than any she could have imagined in life, the eternal defeat of those who would corrupt art in service of evil. And so, with characteristic understatement of his own extraordinary abilities, Sherlock Holmes turned his attention from the grand tragedy of artistic deception to the curious case of a poetic parrot, forever drawn to the intricate puzzles that lay hidden beneath the surface of everyday existence. The fog had lifted from London streets, but the eternal game of truth versus deception continued, illuminated always by the gaslight of reason and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The November fog had settled upon London with unusual persistence when Holmes suggested we make one final pilgrimage to Montague Place. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Blackwood's conviction, an interval marked not by the frenetic energy of pursuit, but by the quieter satisfaction that follows the restoration of justice. The Morning Post had been mercifully thin, and Holmes's violin had returned to gentler meditations, the wild caprices of our recent adversary having left only echoes in its strings. The final discovery. We found Miss Catherine Pemberton waiting for us in the restored studio, her pale features animated by barely contained excitement. The room itself bore little resemblance to the scene of tragedy we had first encountered. Fresh paint gleamed upon the walls, new easels stood ready for future artists, and upon a modest pedestal a pristine cast of Minerva presided with unbroken dignity. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, clutching a leather portfolio bound with familiar indigo silk, "I have discovered something that completes our understanding of Lydia's final weeks. While preparing her effects for the memorial scholarship, I found this concealed within a false bottom of her paint box, a hiding place she had constructed with the same meticulous care she brought to all her work." Holmes accepted the portfolio with the reverence due a sacred relic, his long fingers tracing the silk binding that had featured so prominently throughout our investigation. When he opened it, we were greeted by a revelation that transformed our understanding of Miss Rowan's final performance. The artist as detective. The portfolio contained not merely sketches, but a complete investigative dossier that demonstrated Miss Rowan's growing awareness of her perilous situation. Her preliminary studies showed the same subject in various disguises, each accompanied by observations that revealed her developing mastery of what she termed criminal physiognomy. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, arranging the drawings in chronological sequence. "She was conducting her own investigation, Watson, documenting not merely Blackwood's appearance, but his entire methodology. Her earliest sketch showed the continental gentleman of their first meeting, annotated with the prescient observation. The accent varies between sessions, theatrical training rather than natural origin. Subsequent drawings revealed her growing sophistication in penetrating his deceptions. She had detected the artificial nature of his crescent scar, noting the slight discoloration that betrayed stage makeup. Her observations regarding his hands were particularly astute. She had recognized that his signet ring sat too loosely, suggesting recent acquisition rather than habitual wear. Most significantly, she had begun to suspect that her mysterious patron was studying her technique for his own purposes. "He watches my methods too intently," she had written, as though learning to replicate them rather than simply appreciating the result. "I fear I am teaching him to become a more perfect deceiver." The prepared sacrifice. Perhaps most remarkably, the portfolio revealed the full extent of Miss Rowan's preparations for what she clearly understood might be her final performance. Her plans for the hidden evidence, the modified Minerva bust, the encoded background elements, the chemical preparations for revealing fingerprints, had been laid weeks in advance with military precision. She knew she was likely to die, Miss Pemberton explained, her voice heavy with emotion. Yet she was determined that her death should serve justice rather than merely satisfy her killer's vanity. Holmes studied a detailed diagram showing the exact positioning of evidence within the studio, complete with sight lines and lighting calculations. She transformed her own murder into a masterpiece of detection, Watson. Every element was orchestrated to ensure maximum impact upon those who would investigate her death. Justice rendered. The trial of Marcus Blackwood proved to be the sensation of the season, though not in the manner the defendant had anticipated. Stripped of his disguises and theatrical props, he cut a diminished figure in the dock. His natural features revealed as narrow and calculating, his manner reduced to petulant defiance rather than grand performance. The prosecution's case relied heavily upon Miss Rowan's accumulated evidence, presented with devastating effectiveness by the Crown's counsel. Her triple portrait, displayed prominently before the jury, spoke more eloquently than any living witness could have done. The distinctive notch in Blackwood's ear, visible even in the courtroom, matched perfectly with her meticulous documentation. "The deceased has provided testimony from beyond the grave," the judge observed in his summing up, "more reliable than any oath-bound witness. Watch the ear," she wrote, and in doing so ensured that justice would triumph over even the most elaborate deception. The jury required less than an hour to reach their verdict. Blackwood was sentenced to life imprisonment, his theatrical career concluded not with applause, but with the harsh finality of iron doors closing. The lasting legacy, the establishment of the Lydia Rowan Memorial Scholarship, proceeded with remarkable speed, funded by contributions from unexpected quarters. Captain Staniforth and Lord Ashworth, both grateful for their exoneration, subscribed handsomely to the fund. Even members of London's theatrical community, horrified by Blackwood's corruption of their art, contributed to the memorial. The scholarship would support students dedicated to what was now formally recognized as psychological portraiture, the technique Miss Rowan had pioneered for revealing character beneath any disguise. Her theoretical writings, discovered among the portfolio's contents, were to be published as both artistic instruction and criminological resource. "She has revolutionized our understanding of criminal investigation," Inspector MacDonald observed during our final meeting at the Yard. "Her methods are already being taught to our detectives. The ability to see through elaborate disguises may prove invaluable in combating the increasingly sophisticated criminals of our modern age." The philosophical resolution. As evening settled upon Baker Street and our visitors prepared to depart, Holmes stood in contemplative silence before the charcoal portrait that had initiated our extraordinary adventure. Miss Rowan's masterpiece seemed to glow with inner light, her artistic vision having achieved a victory more complete than any conventional investigation could have accomplished. "She understood something that initially escaped even my analysis," Holmes said quietly. "This was never merely a case of murder disguised as impossible crime. It was a battle between two forms of artistry, one devoted to deception, the other to revelation. Her triumph was achieved not through superior technique alone, but through moral courage applied with artistic precision." He moved to his desk and withdrew a small framed copy of a single line in neat, feminine handwriting. "Watch the ear. Nature's signature cannot be counterfeited." It was his only memorial, and it was sufficient. The eternal game. The following morning brought word that would draw us from our contemplations of artistic justice to more immediate concerns. A telegram from Sussex reported a most peculiar matter involving a ducal household, where a prize-winning parrot had begun reciting passages from unknown Elizabethan plays while systematically pilfering the Duchess's jewelry collection. "The game, Watson," Holmes announced, folding the telegram with characteristic precision, "does not end. It merely changes its costume." As we gathered our effects and prepared for the Sussex Express, Holmes paused for one final glance at Miss Rowan's portrait. "She achieved something unprecedented in criminal investigation," he observed. "She transformed her own murder into a work of art that spoke more eloquently for justice than any living testimony could have done. Her voice will continue to serve truth long after we are gone." The fog was lifting from London's streets as our hansom carried us toward the station, revealing a city bright with autumn sunshine. Yet the lessons of our recent case remained with us. A reminder that in the eternal struggle between truth and deception, the greatest victories were often achieved not through force or cunning, but through the unwavering commitment to revealing the essential character that lies beneath every mask. The case of the girl who drew her killer had reached its proper conclusion, but its influence would endure as long as artists possessed the courage to see through surface appearances to the darkness or light that dwells within the human soul. Miss Lydia Rowan had achieved a form of immortality through her art, and her final masterpiece would continue to speak for justice in the endless game of truth versus deception that defines the human condition. The December fog had settled upon London with the persistence of an old friend reluctant to depart, transforming our familiar Baker Street into a study in grey watercolours and muffled sounds. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Blackwood's conviction, and Holmes had returned to that contemplative quiet which I had learned to associate with the conclusion of our most significant cases. He sat before the fire in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his keen grey eyes fixed upon Miss Rowan's charcoal portrait, which now held permanent residence above our mantelpiece. The Scales of Justice. The trial of Marcus Blackwood proved to be a masterpiece of legal precision rather than theatrical spectacle. Stripped of his elaborate disguises and theatrical props, the defendant cut a diminished figure in the dock, his natural features revealed as narrow and calculating, his manner reduced to sullen defiance rather than grand performance. The prosecution's case relied heavily upon Miss Rowan's accumulated evidence, presented with devastating effectiveness by the Crown's counsel. "The deceased has provided testimony from beyond the grave," the judge observed in his summing up, displaying the triple portrait that had exposed Blackwood's methodology, more reliable than any oath-bound witness. "Her artistic vision has achieved what conventional investigation might never have accomplished, the complete exposure of an elaborate criminal deception." The jury required less than an hour to reach their verdict. Blackwood was sentenced to life imprisonment. His theatrical career concluded not with applause, but with the harsh finality of iron doors closing. Even in defeat, however, he maintained his dramatic sensibilities, offering the court a final bow that managed to convey both acknowledgment of superior intellect and an unsettling suggestion that his influence might yet endure beyond his physical confinement. The Living Memorial. The establishment of the Lydia Rowan Memorial Scholarship proceeded with remarkable efficiency, funded by contributions from unexpected quarters. Captain Staniforth and Lord Ashworth, both grateful for their exoneration, subscribed handsomely to the fund. Members of London's theatrical community, horrified by Blackwood's corruption of their art, contributed generously. Even continental police forces, recognizing the international significance of Miss Rowan's techniques, provided financial support for what they termed a new science of criminal detection. The converted studio in Montague Place was transformed into a permanent exhibition space where Miss Rowan's methods could be studied and refined. Her theoretical writings on psychological portraiture were published to considerable acclaim, finding audiences not merely among artists, but among criminologists, diplomatic services, and medical practitioners who recognized the broader applications of her insights into human character. Mrs. Battersby, elevated to the position of memorial curator, took evident pride in showing visitors the restored studio where young artists now gathered to study what had become formally recognized as the Rowan method. The atmosphere was one of creative energy tempered by respectful remembrance, precisely what the deceased artist would have wished. Holmes's philosophical reflections. "She understood something that initially escaped even my analysis, Watson," Holmes observed during one of our evening discussions, his voice carrying that note of deep respect I had learned to associate with his recognition of exceptional ability. This was never merely a case of murder disguised as impossible crimes. It was a battle between two forms of artistry, one devoted to deception, the other to revelation. He rose and moved to examine the portrait more closely, his magnifying lens revealing details that remained invisible to my untrained eye. Blackwood possessed considerable talent, yet he corrupted that gift in service of criminal ends. Miss Rowan employed similar artistic skills to expose truth rather than conceal it. The difference lay not in technique, but in moral purpose. The broader implications of the case continued to unfold in the weeks following Blackwood's conviction. Scotland Yard reported that techniques derived from Miss Rowan's psychological portraiture were proving invaluable in exposing other criminal deceptions. Continental police forces had begun training their officers in methods of recognizing theatrical disguises and staged crime scenes. The wider web. Our investigation had revealed ramifications extending far beyond a single murder. Blackwood's network of theatrical accomplices, chemical suppliers, and technical specialists had facilitated crimes across 3 countries. The systematic dismantling of this criminal enterprise required coordination between multiple police forces and would continue for months to come. He transformed legitimate artistic endeavors into instruments of deception, Holmes observed, reviewing reports from Paris, Vienna, and Rome that detailed similar crimes bearing Blackwood's distinctive methodology. Art galleries, theatrical companies, even academic institutions all became unwitting participants in his elaborate performances. Yet perhaps most significantly, Miss Rowan's victory had established principles that would guide future efforts to combat such sophisticated criminal deception. Her techniques were being incorporated into formal training programs. Her insights into human character were being studied by scholars, and her moral courage was inspiring a new generation of artists committed to serving truth rather than mere aesthetic pleasure. The eternal game. As winter deepened and our contemplation of the case reached its natural conclusion, the familiar rhythms of Baker Street reasserted themselves. The Morning Post brought its usual collection of mysteries and consultations, each representing another challenge to Holmes's extraordinary faculties. A telegram from Sussex caught his particular attention, something involving a ducal household, a literary parrot, and missing jewelry that promised complications worthy of our attention. Holmes folded the message with characteristic precision, his eyes already brightening with that familiar spark of intellectual curiosity. "The game, Watson," he announced with understated satisfaction, "assumes ever more intriguing forms. It appears that even the animal kingdom possesses secrets worthy of investigation." As we prepared for this new adventure, Holmes paused for one final contemplation of Miss Rowan's portrait. The young artist's eyes seemed to follow us with benevolent approval, her final masterpiece serving as both memorial and inspiration for all future efforts to serve justice through the application of reason and artistic vision. The lasting truth. "She achieved something unprecedented in criminal investigation," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying deep admiration for the murdered artist. "She transformed her own death into a work of art that spoke more eloquently for justice than any living testimony could have done. Her voice will continue to serve truth long after we are gone." The fog was lifting from London's streets as our hansom carried us toward the station, revealing a city bright with winter sunshine. Yet the lessons of our recent case remained with us, a reminder that in the eternal struggle between truth and deception, the greatest victories were often achieved not through force or cunning alone, but through the unwavering commitment to revealing the essential character that lies beneath every mask. The case of the girl who drew her killer had reached its proper conclusion, but its influence would endure as long as artists possessed the courage to see through surface appearances, to the darkness or light that dwells within the human soul. Miss Lydia Rowan had achieved a form of immortality through her art, and her final masterpiece would continue to speak for justice in the endless game of truth versus deception that defines the human condition. As the train carried us toward Sussex and our next adventure, Holmes settled back in his seat with that expression of quiet satisfaction that marked the successful conclusion of a complex case. The world would continue to present its mysteries, criminals would devise new deceptions, and somewhere, artists like Miss Rowan would continue to illuminate truth with their vision. The game, as my remarkable friend would say, was indeed eternal, and so, thankfully, was the human capacity for justice, courage, and the patient pursuit of truth through even the most elaborate shadows that evil might cast across the world. Thus concludes The Case of the Girl Who Drew Her Killer, wherein the marriage of artistic vision and deductive reasoning achieved a victory more complete than either could have accomplished alone. In death, Miss Lydia Rowan became not merely a victim, but a detective whose final testimony would inspire future generations in the eternal pursuit of truth over deception.